Good morning, everybody. It's sure great to be here again talking to all my friends at the WRP. For those of you who heard that I had retired and thought you would never be subjected to this again, it is true I have retired, but you're being subjected to still another talk from me. One thing also that comes with retirement is sometimes you don't stay as close to the details. And so I'd like to make just a minor change. The title of my talk on the agenda is Observations on 20 Years. This is going to be observations on 40 years of AIS management in Montana. With that said, there's just a few comments I'd like to preface this with. First of all, when I was approached about this, I made it clear that this was going to be my observations on the issue. And what that means is this is my thoughts and ideas and opinions. And I'm not telling you that anybody out there would agree with everything exactly the way that I'm going to be saying it. But this is how I recollect 40 years. I also want to, and I think this is important, I need to say that my views on the Montana program are shaped by who I interact with and where I interact from. And any of you that have seen any of my presentations on community-based social marketing know that I stress how important it is to try to put yourself in somebody else's seat and view an issue through somebody else's eyes. The truth is we all view issues through the eyes of where we are at the time. I have an advantage that a lot of people in this room don't have in that I've had a lot of different perspectives on this issue over the 40 years. First 16 years of my career was spent actually with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks doing wild trout studies on the Yellowstone River in the Livingston area. From there, I moved to a dozen years with an international conservation organization, the Federation of Fly Fishers, and then I founded ISAN. And along the way, I also served 9 years on the National Advisory Committee. So what I've got that a lot of other people don't have is longevity, which hopefully you'll all have 40 years on this in the future. And the other thing is I've seen the issues from a lot of different perspectives. So, and the other thing, I'm going to cover 40 years. I'm not going to be able to go into much detail about anything, or we'd be here for a lot longer than the time I have allotted. So when I was first started with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in the late 70s, we thought, well, let me back up and first say I started as a field level employee. And so I talk about viewing through the eyes of where you're at. I was a low-level employee, so I'll have to tell you there may have been things going on in the 70s that were levels above me that I wasn't aware of. But the truth of the matter is AIS really were not on the radar screen in any substantive manner at that time in the 70s. Montana did feel they had an invasive species issue, and that issue was introduced fish-on-fish invasion. And there was a huge problem with bait bucket biologists. Yellow perch were getting stocked all over the place. And Montana did have a fairly aggressive program to try to combat that. And that program goes on through today, and I believe we've got a presentation coming up talking about that. But that's really where the focus was at that time. Like I say, there were a lot of perch and other introductions going on. And the other thing that was happening in the late 70s was a greater increase in focus within Fish, Wildlife, and Parks on native trout conservation. We recognized that our native species were in many places having significant problems, and in most of those problems were actually being caused by fish that we as an agency had stocked on top of them. But highlighting that need for native fish conservation also highlighted, at least to me, the issue that we have invaders that are causing this problem. And so that was going on. And then it was further reinforced that fish on fish was our greatest problem when in the mid-1980s, walleyes started appearing all over the state of Montana. And we had anglers, we assume anglers, hauling these fish around and stocking them all over the place. And so we had a significant fish-on-fish problem. And so those early years, the 70s and the 80s, from my perspective, most of the focus was on fish invasion. Montana actually, in retrospect, was very fortunate. We're geographically isolated. We had a different climate at that time, which was quite harsh. And the reality was we really didn't have much for AIS on the landscape. And so you know what's in front of your face. We didn't have it in front of our face. We didn't perceive it as a big problem. Certainly there were instances, I won't talk about mysis shrimp, which wiped out the kokanee fishery in Flathead Lake. That was an intentional introduction, but we today, I think, would call that an invasive species. But by the mid-1990s, a couple things happened that really started to broaden the perspective that ANS were more than just fish. And the first thing that happened was whirling disease. 1984, the Madison River here in Montana, fisheries work showed that rainbow trout populations had declined on somewhere between 80 and 90%. Subsequently, it was determined that that was the result of whirling disease. Whirling disease is still around today. I want to just speak very briefly because I could give more than a talk on the history of whirling disease, but there was a massive public response. The Madison River at that time was probably the most famous fishery in the world, and with 90% declines for the rainbows, the angling community was aghast. And they responded. There was calls for donations. A nonprofit group called the Whirling Disease Foundation was formed in Bozeman, Montana. It later became federally legislatively authorized. They raised and awarded more than $7 million in research grants over the next 10 years. And I felt at the time, I came to feel, and I feel even more today, that that research badly failed the issue of promoting AIS as a true problem. That research was focused on hard laboratory science. We cracked the genetic code of the tubifex worm. We never provided a single management recommendation to biologists and others as to how to mitigate for this disease or what to do. Anglers watched millions and millions of dollars that they donated being spent on research with nothing to show, and in the meantime, the Madison River recovered on its own. I can't tell you what that did in the angling community when we came back to them and tried to convince them that AIS were a real issue, because they knew that whirling disease was nothing but a boondoggle in their minds. So I thought that that was pretty significant. There was a big lesson that I learned from that, and I hope we all learn, and that's we have to engage effectively with the public, and we have to give the public realistic understanding of what we're doing. And whenever possible, we have to give the public actions that they can take. The only way to keep them engaged and to give them ownership in the issue is to give them action. These issues really started to open the eyes that AIS was a bigger issue than fish on fish. And in my mind, for Montana AIS, one of the significant watershed moments actually happened in 2001. And in 2001, the state of Montana was visited by a group from Oregon with Mark Sitzma and a few other folks who came and sat down with a small group here in the state and said, you guys need to develop a state ANS management plan. And here's why, and here's what it's going to do for you. Well, this was early on in the game of management plans. The state of Montana didn't have wholehearted enthusiasm at the time. However, I had moved on at that time from the agency and was working for the Federation of Fly Fishers. And one of the nice things you can do as an NGO is exert political pressure. And so I was able to convince the fish chief at the time to move forward with the Montana plan. Like I say, the folks from Oregon came in 2001, and we formed a writing committee to write the plan. It seemed to me like we were moving at a snail's pace at the time, but the reality is, in retrospect, we moved at light speed. At the fall 2002 ANSTF, the Montana plan was approved. So less than 18 months from the time it was conceived until approval. was pretty neat. And so that also allowed Montana to secure funding. At that point in time, I think Montana was somewhere between number 12 and 14 maybe for state plans, but we got a big slice of that pie at that time, that funding pie. And what that enabled Montana to do was hire an ANS coordinator. And in 2004, they hired the first Montana ANS coordinator, and that was Eileen Rice. A lot of you know Eileen. She served for many years in leadership in the WRP and also the Mississippi Basin Panel. Eileen has moved up the ladder, and today she is fish chief for the state of Montana. But Eileen was hired in 2004, and it was very interesting. I had indicated at the time that the department didn't have wholehearted enthusiasm about having an ANS program. They kind of felt like it was forced on them, and they weren't even sure what this person was going to do. And so they decided that since whirling disease had been a major issue, that they would put the focus on fish health issues. And let me back up and say, Montana's always had a very strong fish health program. When I said earlier all they were concerned about was fish on fish, they've always had a strong fish health program as well. But at that time, they thought that that was pretty likely, and actually the position initially was 3/4 time ANS coordinator, 1/4 time fish health specialist. And so the ANS coordinator was going around taking kidney samples at the hatcheries and doing stuff like that. They really weren't sure what this position was. Fortunately, they hired Eileen, and Eileen knew what this position could be. And she brought a lot of change to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. The first thing she did was said, this needs to be all taxa. We have threats that we don't even recognize that are out there from all kinds of organisms. It's not fish on fish, it's not fish health, it's a whole program. She also moved the program from being species-based. And I didn't mention another species that popped up there in the late 80s, early 90s was New Zealand mud snails. For New Zealand mud snails, whirling disease, we dealt with them on a species basis. And really our management at the time was to put up a sign at an access site that says this water is infested. And we'd have one sign for whirling disease, we'd have another sign for mud snails. If we'd have had other species, we just would have had more signs. Well, Eileen recognized that species-based programs were not the way to go. And so in Montana, she really led the effort to focus on prevention as our primary management tool. And we all pretty much follow that today. The other thing that Eileen did was Eileen initiated Watercraft inspections. And this was in, I believe, 2005. She probably started doing the first watercraft inspections in Montana. At that time, they were all access-based, boat ramp-based, and they were mostly informational. But it allowed her to establish great relationships with groups like Walleyes Unlimited and other angling organizations that paid big dividends going forward. And finally, during those early years of Montana ANS coordinator, Eileen instituted the Inspect Clean Dry campaign. And so the Inspect Clean Dry campaign included that action message to engage the public, you know, and today almost everybody has a 3-word saying of some sort. I thought it was kind of interesting. A lot of people never recognized the Montana program at the time, but Inspect Clean Dry predated all of the rest of the language that was being used, and yet Montana ultimately became criticized by some people for using that language. It's just interesting how time changes our perspective. And our perspectives were all changed dramatically in 2007 when mussels were discovered in Lake Mead. And everybody should be aware of how that changed things in the West. It triggered a significant regional response. Many new programs were enacted in many of our Western states. A lot of new coordinators were hired. A lot of new people came to the table. And along with new people in agencies, whole new constituencies came up that we had never been, I'll say, forced to deal with in the past. Historic constituency for the ANS program was fishermen. And that was real easy for a Fish and Wildlife Agency because that was their constituency for their entire fishing program. All of a sudden, with mussels being discovered, whole new groups emerged, lake owner associations, water resource, all kinds of new. I'm not going to go on because we see it continuing to expand today. But this really was a fundamental change that caused the state to have to look at the whole program differently. But Montana continued with that program, and like I say, it brought the mussels in Mead brought a whole new attention. And along with that, I say a whole new constituency, and one of the new constituencies that got involved was the legislature and legislatures across the West. Prior to 2007, the ANS programs, especially in Montana, were entirely the province of the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Agency. So generally speaking, the ANS coordinator would say, this is a good idea, tell the fish chief, get sign off, and they'd just go do it. All of a sudden, all kinds of people wanted to have a say. And in 2009, the Montana Legislature passed the Montana AIS Act. What a mess. It was horrible. It split authorities between Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, who had authorities for all the living creatures in the water, Montana Department of Agriculture, who had responsibility for all of the plants in the water. However, that was further complicated because by state law, the counties in Montana are responsible for weed control, and so the legislature made a giant mess, didn't straighten anything out. There was a lot of political activity that took place with this as well. Authorities were created to create what was called special management areas, where the state would have limited authority to do watercraft inspection stations. Because Department of Ag and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks didn't get along at all, it was a mess. We'd have times where the two agencies would each have inspection stations on opposite sides of the road in the same place. It was really something. Subsequent legislatures, so there was a citizens group that formed, an advocacy group. We weren't an authorized council in any way. We formed intentionally excluding the agencies from this group in order for us to provide unbiased recommendations. 2009, Montana Legislature meets every other year, so it takes us a while to get laws put through. But in 2009, changes were made. Changes have subsequently been made along the way. I'm not going to talk much about, 2016, then everything really changed dramatically. The 2009 Montana AIS Act showed me how quickly our trajectory that we think we are on could be derailed by people with more power and authority who thought we should go somewhere else. And that was the first time I started seeing that happen. Well, then in 2016, as Tom already mentioned, as most of you know, there was the mussel discovery in Tiber Reservoir, suspect discovery in Canyon Ferry. And I really got a lesson then in how quick AIS people can be taken out of the loop. For a variety of reasons, the governor of Montana decided that the mussel response in Montana was best addressed by an agency other than Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Primarily excluded Fish, Wildlife, and Parks from that process, and decisions about the program, the future of the program, staffing levels, even on down to where inspection stations would be located, were often made without the input of the professional AIS staff with the state. This showed me real keenly how quickly we can lose control of an issue. And I want to talk about that. I have lost track of time. Does anybody got a few minutes still? All right. Oh. No. I only need a couple minutes. All right. Well, I did want to build off of that because putting on a little bit broader hat, I think a real challenge to this group right now is who is going to chart the course of AIS programs in the future. Is it going to be the AIS coordinators, researchers, and workers who are close to the field and know what's going on, or is it going to be politicians? Okay, we've seen it play out some in states, but we all know how quickly the federal government could step in and do whatever they wanted to do. And so I think it's critical that you find a way to try to significantly influence activities moving forward. Elizabeth talked about the coordination, and that's an important effort. I think there's got to be a broad recognition that there's significant changes going on. Commercial interests are becoming larger and larger. For-profit businesses are becoming a much bigger part of the AIS field as we look at the whole field. Well, and we all know how much budgets have grown in the recent years. As more money comes in, more people want a piece, more people want a voice. This is going to continue to accelerate. The professionals working on AIS, I'm afraid, are going to lose their voice unless you're not vigilant. And you see the massive amounts of work put out by the WRP. You have to all recognize that that is volunteer effort. There's nothing, if you get some changes in fish chiefs in a couple of states who tell their coordinators, no, you don't have time to serve on WRP, what's going to happen to these products? WRP is leading the country. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind about that the rest of the nation is looking to the West for programs and suggestions and protocols for moving forward. It's up to you guys. If you sit back, your ability to shape and direct programs will diminish. If that's what you want, if you want to just show up to work and do your job and let somebody else worry about all that stuff, rest assured somebody else is going to make all those decisions. I would say get involved, bring best practices up through the level. And the last thing I want to mention is that I think this is a really exciting time for all of you that are professionals in the AIS field. We all know how much the field has grown. It's a high-profile issue. 10 years ago, I had trouble telling people what an invasive species was. They couldn't get their mind around the issue. Today, everybody knows. Elizabeth mentioned how governors know. This is on everyone's radar screen. This is a huge economic issue as well as an environmental issue. It's only going to get bigger. I say that I believe that that's a reality, but I think it's unfortunate because the reason it's going to get bigger is there's always going to be new invaders, more invaders. And so the goal for all of you is to work yourself out of a job. I hope you succeed. I would also mention it's an exciting time to be in the field because of all the new employment opportunities. We've all seen agency programs growing, agency staff being added. As those staff are added, it creates new management levels. We look here to Montana to see the best example where we have Tom Wolf actually serving as a Fisheries Bureau Chief. A significant management position, and even more significantly, Eileen Rice, who started in the AIS program, is now the fish chief for the state. You guys are on a pathway that can lead you to wherever you want to go. Embrace it, take advantage, and go for it. And lastly, to echo what Elizabeth was saying, you guys are doing important work. You're changing North America, you're changing attitudes, you're impacting the future. Keep it up. Thank you.